Having a nice time there, fat baby? On Memorial Day, Allison and I took the kids to Kennesaw Mountain Battlefield. Kennesaw Mountain Battlefield is in the middle of Cobb County, and it's a Civil War battlefield site where William Sherman came to fight the Confederates under a man named Joseph Johnson. Those two names are going to play a role a little bit in this vlog. It was the last Confederate victory before ultimately Sherman put siege to Atlanta and burned it in November of 1864. However, Sherman, in typical Sherman fashion, understood the prize was Atlanta and not Kennesaw Mountain, and simply outflanked Joe Johnson in the night, and Joe had to retreat back to the outskirts of Atlanta. He was then sacked for a general who was more aggressive, who promptly forced battle, lost to Sherman, forced retreat, and Atlanta was burned November 1864. Explain that to a 4-year-old. Ultimately, all we could get across to Rhett and Paisley was there are Yankees and there are Confederates. They disagreed and they fought. Of course, my son then followed up with the question, well, Daddy, who's the good guy and who's the bad guy? There are two narratives on the Civil War. One is the Northern and one is the Southern, and I actually was raised on both because I learned the Civil War while I was living in Chicago and not in the South. However, I was born in the South and ultimately have spent most of my 31 years have been spent here in Atlanta. And so I've actually heard both narratives pretty explicitly, and let me explain the difference between the two. In the North, the narrative is very simple. South secedes over slavery, North decides to invade to free slaves. Nuances, back and forth. Ultimately, good guy Abraham Lincoln, good guy Ulysses S. Grant, good guy William Tecumseh Sherman. At the end, Abraham Lincoln is assassinated by a bad guy and becomes tragic hero. Boom, done. Fast forward to Theodore Roosevelt. That is U.S. history in the North.
Good out to about 200 yards. That means if you read of the artillery shooting canister, they are getting desperate. You weren't given a lot of these. The idea being, if you're...
In the South, you see, there are multiple narratives, and certainly the slavery plays a role, but it's an interesting role because it's changed over time. The narrative in the South is much more about a northern population of economic might and quantity that was choking out the economic life and culture of the South. The South, particularly the plantation owners, felt threatened by the North, and of course the plantation owners, the wealthy, were the ones mostly in government. Slavery portion of the Civil War is reduced in the South, and of course that's problematic because in South Carolina the declaration that they declared that they were an independent state talks more about slavery than it seems anything else. The North's threat of abolishing slavery is enough that they feel the two sides can't reconcile. So actually the narrative is a bit problematic for the South. It's been added much later. To the average person living in the South who doesn't own slaves, the slavery issue is not as much of a big deal. But here's a democratically elected state government that's saying we no longer think that we belong in a union, and they secede, although there are no rules on how to do that. And a North that invades. And to the average Southerner, here you come into my land, into my farms, into my homes, into my factories, into my cities, and you wish to burn up, tear up, destroy my livelihood. There's a narrative here to the Southerner that they're defending their own land, they're defending their own stuff. What's on your mouth? The lesson, Rhett, Paisley, Holland of the future, because at 4 you're not able to hear it, is this. It's actually less important that you pass judgment to the point of saying good guy and bad guy. It's more important that you understand the cause, the cost, the inputs, the outputs, that these things happened, why they happened, and who drove them. It's more important to understand that it happened and that it can tell you a host of things about a host of things than to assign an ethical or moral boundary to one side or the other. There is clearly the more powerful and the weaker. And the more powerful one, and the more powerful tells the narrative that makes it into the vast majority of the things that you're going to be told. The importance is to bypass the narratives, seek the facts, understand the underlying points of the storyline. That when we assign good and bad events, what we are truly doing is writing a narrative that's going to support something that we want in our own time. So you, much older Rhett, Paisley, and Holland, watching this video maybe a decade from now on your first trip to Kennesaw Mountain, weren't quite ready to hear this, but you will hear this each time we return until you are ready to hear it. I will leave you with this story. William Sherman and Joe Johnson live past the Civil War. Joe Johnson runs for Congress. William Sherman, of course, becomes the commander of the U.S. forces thereafter. And these two men have a deep set of respect for each other. What they ultimately do is become deep friends after the Civil War, to the point where it is Joe Johnson who carries Sherman's casket in Sherman's funeral. Remarking that it was cold and rainy, he didn't take off his hat. A month later, Joe Johnson dies of pneumonia caught at Sherman's funeral. Rhett and Paisley, by the time you watch this video and understand it, one of the two people running for president right now will have become and been and probably be finished with their term in office, and the other will have become a footnote in history, and all we ever hear all day is right and wrongs in narrative storytelling, which rewrites truth into that to which supports what I need you to believe. Truth is sacrificed when we must render judgment upon events. Only render judgment when necessary, and never sacrifice truth in the process.